And if Canada can't figure this out, tell me what corner of the world is going to figure this out.
Welcome back to Question Period. As we were discussing earlier in this show, that's the Prime Minister this week calling the recent rise in anti-Semitism in Canada terrifying. He's also continuing to support humanitarian pauses in hostilities, which Israel has now agreed to do daily for 4 hours. But here at home, there are also loud calls for him to support a total ceasefire, including from the NDP, who wrote him an open letter asking for exactly that. So can the federal government strike a balance between domestic pressure and its position that Israel has the right to defend itself? The Scrum is here to talk about that. Sherelle Evelyn is the managing editor at the Hill Times. Robert Fife is the Ottawa bureau chief for the Globe and Mail. And Robert Benzie is the Queen's Park bureau chief for the Toronto Star. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Really good to see you today. Rob, why don't I start with you? This week certainly was the most, I think, since October 7th that we heard from the Prime Minister, particularly as it concerned the rise in anti-Semitism and then, as he said, also in Islamophobia. What do you think of the way he's navigating what we just outlined in the introduction there?
I think that the Prime Minister said some things that needed to be said, Vashi, that probably should have been said a little bit earlier. I mean, we're seeing a lot of troubling incidents across the country. On Friday, a few blocks from my office at Queen's Park, the Indigo store was vandalized with some graffiti criticizing Heather Reisman, who is Jewish, who is the founder of that company. And it's very troubling that a lot of the things that are happening in the Middle East are kind of being amplified on social media here and then coming onto our streets. So I think it's important that everyone kind of realize that Canada has a role to play on the world stage, but the fight that is happening in Gaza and in Israel is not necessarily what should be happening on the streets of Toronto or Ottawa or Montreal.
What's your sense, Sherelle, of the kinds of pressures the Prime Minister is facing, even from within his own caucus? I mentioned the NDP writing that letter, that public letter calling for a ceasefire more largely or wider in scope than any kind of humanitarian pause. There are also members of his own caucus, like almost 3 dozen of them, who have signed another letter echoing that call. Your sense of how that's playing out behind the scenes?
You get the sense that people aren't necessarily feeling heard, and so you start to see, I think, over the past couple of weeks, more and more open letters to the Prime Minister. I'm thinking of one that was signed just the other day by, I believe it was Liberal MP Peter Fonseca, and it was, it's addressed to the Prime Minister. It's calling for a ceasefire, but it's not, delivered quietly to the Prime Minister. It's put out on social media for everybody to see, and you get the sense that those types of things are happening because they're not necessarily feeling heard, or they want to especially signal to the wider population that, hey, I am saying this, and I'm saying it publicly, and I'm saying it in front of you for everybody to hear me, so that you know what my, where my, I don't want to say call allegiance is, but where my thoughts are on this. So when you have those kinds of divisions within caucus and you have them playing out publicly, you've got to think it's got to be a difficult situation to manage. And Prime Minister is not necessarily well known for, listening to and having all of his MPs feel as though they're being heard by him.
It's interesting also because as the leader of the Liberals, Bob, he's in a more unique position versus, for example, Pierre Poilievre with the Conservatives or Jagmeet Singh with the NDP. Their caucuses have different positions, but they're united around those positions. The Liberal caucus is really the only one that's split to the degree it is.
Yeah, but the Prime Minister is in lockstep with the United States and our allies on this. He's not going to call for a ceasefire right now because the Americans are not calling for a ceasefire. And that's because they're afraid that Hamas will regroup again. And you have to remember that Hamas holds medieval theocratic views and they have modern weapons and they want to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. At the same time, the horrific images of women and children in Gaza is heartbreaking. And the Americans and the Canadians and the Europeans are asking Israel to, you've got to have pauses. But the thing here that we need to hear from Israel, and I don't think you're going to get it from Bibi Netanyahu, unfortunately, is that you want to work with the United States, the Europeans, the Canadians, moderate Arab states, when this war is over and Hamas is gone, to have a viable Palestinian Authority, a state with the West Bank and Gaza, which is not living in the kind of poverty they are, but they're going to rebuild that into a really prosperous country. It's going to take some time, but we have to hear that from Israel. At the end, if we don't hear that, this is going to continue and continue and continue.
Well, I think that's also politically salient here in Canada as well, right? Because in the absence of that, and you know, to some degree, I'm not saying it's understandable, but the focus right now, Rob, is on what's unfolding, you know, acutely or more imminently. But I think Bob's point is a good one, right? Like the long-term impacts of this are also really significant. Do you anticipate that challenge continues to grow for the federal government here? Or like Bob says, are they just going to remain in lockstep with the U.S., which has articulated a very specific position as well?
I mean, Vashi, I think Canada has to remain in lockstep with the United States and the United Kingdom. I mean, we saw France talking about a ceasefire. Macron was talking about that, and Mélanie Joly kind of echoed that. But I think she went off in a different direction from the Prime Minister on Thursday. But I do think that our foreign policy almost always echoes the United States, and in the Middle East, I think it should. Although we didn't move our embassy to Jerusalem like the United States did under ex-President Trump. It's still in Tel Aviv. I've been to our embassy. It's a nice spot in Tel Aviv. But I think the challenge, as Bob mentions, is what happens after this war. The rebuilding of Gaza is going to be very expensive. Hamas, it's a different beast altogether. And what happens after this war is over is going to be a really interesting challenge for the whole world, frankly.
I think here in Canada, the same question applies, though, Sherelle, because what we have seen is like hard to unsee. Like the things that have happened over the past month domestically, I think leave an impression that politicians, whatever party's in charge, is going to have to reconcile with.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, we're seeing it, I think, a little more across the border in the U.S., where, you know, President Joe Biden is really feeling, you know, politically in the polls, like he is seeing a drop in support from certain parts of the population who had traditionally supported him because of his stance and because in supporting, or how far he's willing to go in support of Israel. How much that is going to affect the Canadian political scene, obviously yet to be determined, but I can't imagine that there wouldn't be people who are right now looking at what's going on, seeing how politicians are reacting, and thinking about the future.
Okay, on that note, I'll leave it there. Sherelle Evelyn, Bob Fife, and Rob Benzie, thanks so much.